Inspiration for Teachers podcast, bringing you dynamic and inspirational educator interviews. Our fascinating guests share their professional challenges and creative resolutions for success. Discover their workable strategies, ideas, and resources to reach your educational goals. And now your host, Kelly Long.
Hello, my awesome community of listeners. How are you doing? You're through to another show of Inspiration for Teachers. Before I welcome today's guest, I'm super excited to share with you the interesting topics that we're going to be discussing on today's show. That includes everything differentiation through to critical thinking, how to teach business studies, or some good ideas for it, the PGCE year, and reflective practice. So everything resource-based, lesson ideas, and everything we can think of in this episode to support you. Let's get started. I'd like to welcome today's guest. Charlotte, hello and welcome to the show. Please can you start off by giving our listeners a little bit of information about who you are?
So my name's Charlotte Meierdirk. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Portsmouth. I work in the School of Education and I have a number of roles. One of my main roles is to train business studies, PGCE students, and that's in schools and in colleges. But I also train the PGCE students across the board, and I teach the master's degree. So I teach the MSc in Education and Training. So I teach a lot of qualified teachers and senior managers in schools master's degrees as well.
At the start of every show, Charlotte, I like to keep my guests on their toes and do an immediate deep dive into your knowledge by asking you a question you have no prior knowledge of. I guess it's a little way of reminding us how it feels to be a pupil in one of our classrooms. So if you're ready, what do you think the biggest headache is for teachers right now?
I would say playing the game and jumping through so many hoops. I don't actually think that actually the students in the classroom, the pupils in the classroom are the biggest problem. I think it's all the other pressures that come with teaching. Knowing, for example, what paperwork you have in case Ofsted turn up, continually setting targets for all your pupils all the time, where they're going to be in a few years' time, where they are now. Continually knowing if they're engaged within the class, what the next target is. So I think actually, I would say things like behaviour, although Ofsted likes to talk about behaviour, I think what I see in the classroom, behaviour actually I think has got better in the classroom, and it's actually all the other, I would say what I call performativity, target setting, etc., that teachers have to meet that have become greater.
How do you get your teachers to manage that? Because there is a lot of paperwork and it is very challenging to know what to prioritise. So what advice do you give to your trainee teachers when it comes to that?
I'm very, very upfront with them. I do tell them that paperwork is just really very, very important. You have to stay on top of it. You have to continually, for them, they have to update their files. But, in some of their classes, they have to set the targets for the students that they should be in all their classes. They should know their grades, they should know the data. And I think actually a lot of them are really quite surprised by how much paperwork comes with teaching, actually. I think a lot of them have this preconception that teaching is about, just standing up in front of the class, progressing the students, which it is, but of course you and I both know there's an awful lot more to it and the paperwork that goes with it. So a lot of it is just being organised. And I'd say actually getting through a PGCE year, there's quite a big percentage of it that actually is being organised and being on top of your paperwork. So some are very, very good at it, and some not. In business studies, I'm quite lucky. They seem to be quite good at it, actually. But I know in some subjects, it's a harder skill to learn.
Do you know what? If I ever leave my school, the words that they will attribute to me is being misorganised. And it's a bit sad, really, because I quite like something more colourful. But you have to be organised because it's so easy to let things slip. I think that's what leads to good teaching practice if you are on top of that paperwork. What we're going to do is jump on nicely to what excites you now about the teaching profession.
What's exciting? Actually, do you know what at the moment, I would say, although I'm not the biggest fan of Ofsted for various reasons, I would say there's the focus on progressive students, making sure they are, trying to achieve the best they can. I mean, I actually quite like that. I also quite like the fact that so many schools aren't so, although they are target driven, they are taking into account other areas to improve pupils. So, their social welfare, what clubs they provide. And I think, for me, there's a lot more to education than actually just setting a target and for them meeting a grade. Pupils need to come out a lot more rounded. They need a lot of skills. And I think although, not to get too political, our present government, Michael Gove, what he used to talk about when he was the Minister of Education, he was very much not keen on skills in class. He was more to do with learning traditional subjects. But I think actually a lot of schools are keeping that, and I think that's very important, actually. So it's nice to see that schools are actually saying, look, I know what the government's saying, but I don't completely agree with it, and we'd like to continue actually progressing the skills of the pupils. And I think that's quite good.
I even feel that in business studies, there are so many skills that we're not teaching pupils, and they really need to know how to harness these skills. Some of the technology that's coming online, packages that you can use, create really professional business documents. We're not really teaching them those skills because it's not part of the curriculum, and yet it's so important that they have those skills because they need to be the future leaders, the future entrepreneurs, and we don't really address that all the time. So I'm glad you find that interesting. But what do you think about that in terms of business studies and how we teach it?
I mean, a lot of although I don't know if you remember the old PELTS, personal learning.
Yes, I do, yes.
Of course, that's been dropped. But it's amazing how many, for example, FE colleges still keep it because they think it was a good idea. And I have to say that, I agree with you that especially in something like business studies, the way the pupils present themselves, the way they do presentations, the way they talk. I mean, there's so many important skills that are needed for business apart from just grades. And I think, I'm sure you also know that a lot of businesses, the CBI, are always complaining that they have these graduates that come out of university with grades. They could be an A grade or a graduate with a first degree, but they can't actually pick up a phone and make a sensible phone call. And unfortunately, I think with the present government's, the way we're going at the moment and the way we're going in education, they don't see that as important. Although I'm very much with you on this one, Kelly. I do think most of my friends that work in business or industry or work in the city in London, they said that they'd rather have a student with lower grades but better people skills than someone who had good grades, really good grades, but couldn't present themselves, couldn't actually engage in a conversation.
I'm a big advocate of vocational qualifications and how we teach those skills to the pupils and enhance their skill set. And it did make them more kind of professional and willing to answer a phone because we put them in those scenarios. It's a real shame that we've moved away from that and it's become more academic and we've lost that element and those skills. I think we do come from the same ballpark with that one.
It was the Wolf report that said and recommended that, our vocational qualifications weren't strong enough. And of course, as soon as the government or the Ministry of Education decide that, some BTECs cannot be included in the league tables, then actually you see the schools dropping those vocational qualifications. And it is a shame because there's pupils in schools where that's their avenue, that is their calling. Not everyone is cut out to pass very academic traditional subjects. I mean, students could be very intelligent, but it's just displayed in a very different way.
I think that's a whole podcast in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, probably.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question, and it's a bit of a thought-provoking one, and we've probably touched on it slightly just then, but what aspects of teaching or education would you most like to change, large or small, and if it hasn't been possible, why you believe that might be?
I think we need to teach pupils more critical thinking. I'm a firm believer that more and more our educational system, for various reasons, because we are become exam driven, and that's not just in schools, that's the same in colleges, it's the same actually now in universities. What we are producing, and this might be slightly controversial, we tend to produce more pupils and students that are they don't like to be taught anything outside of that exam syllabus. They just want to be taught what gets them through the exam. They want to know what they need to get that A or B or C grade, and they're less likely at the moment to actually think, I'd say, for themselves more. And there's various reasons why that's happened, and the target-driven culture has kind of produced that. But what we see now at universities, we see more and more students that can't think for themselves, and they all they want to know is exactly what they need to do to pass a paper. And actually, what we need to be doing is encouraging more critical thinking. within school. So the students actually can debate, and they can actually ask why more, and they can actually sit there and think, actually, there's more to it than just exams. There's more that I need to know, and I need to question. Because at the moment, we kind of produce some more, dare I say it, more yes kind of students, rather students that are actually say, well, why? And I think if I could change anything, that would be it, actually.
So many people that have come on the show have said the exact same thing about changing the system and the accountability and not having it so target-driven and so exam-based. Speaking to a guest, Jason Borter, principal of a school in Australia, and he said the exact same thing, that, by having such an exam-driven culture, it's taking the thought process out of the children because it's putting all the accountability on the teacher. But what I'd be really interested to find out, Charlotte, is how do we change that? How do we get a child to think more critically whilst trying to teach and do everything that we're supposed to be doing anyway?
There's a $100 question. I think you can easily do that. And I think one way to do it is to actually engage more with a bit of philosophy, which may sound scary for secondary students, but actually you can discuss philosophy in a way where you can actually make it very approachable and accessible for children. And I know this is going to sound very traditional, but I actually really like debating. I'm a big fan of debating, and now we've dropped that from most schools, although we're actually seeing a slight resurgence of it. But I think students being able to debate ideas is very important, because then, yes, they can construct arguments, and also, but they can look at both sides of the argument, but not just about something that's going to be in an exam paper, like, let's say, a GCSE exam paper on business studies, why or why not should a company merge, but on much larger issues. But I think debating and trying to get students to debate more and construct arguments verbally, I think that's a very good way of encouraging critical thinking, because it's moving away from students believing the way that we have it is the way it must be, and it doesn't have to be that way. It's actually questioning structures that we live by. And it is very hard for pupils and students and adults, to be fair, to think of, does it have to be this way? What other ways could we have it? So it might be even with schools saying to them, okay, if we didn't have Ofsted, what else could we have? Would we need something else? Or if we didn't have someone telling us what subjects we had to study, what kind of curriculum do you think we would have in school? So it's getting them to think outside the box. And I think it can be done. It's finding the time in the very busy curriculum to do it, I think.
That conversation about how do we think differently about how we approach subjects and how we run our schools and how we focus on education and what is important. That's a really exciting and interesting question. That links us on nicely to what your challenge is.
That was a really hard one, because as you know, and other teachers know, that actually the bar that teachers have to jump has become higher. So what Ofsted require for outstanding has become a lot more difficult. And so, we almost equate the new good with the old outstanding. So it's become a lot harder. And so most schools that I know of that were outstanding, apart from King's, and those that were good have dropped down for areas for improvement. And actually, so for the student teachers, the same thing has happened, that they actually have to work so much harder to get the outstanding than they used to have to work. So if we look at the criteria for student teachers, to get an outstanding, you need to have, your pupils need to be fully engaged all the time, well, as much as possible. They need to all be progressing, but not just progressing. They have to be stretched at their particular level. Now, for some people, that might sound like it should be easy, but when you've got a class of 30, 14-year-olds, all at very different levels, trying to differentiate for every single person in that class, stretching every person in the class, keeping them all engaged at the same time, plus doing hundreds of other things, actually is quite a difficult task, I think. Not just for student teachers, I think it's difficult for all teachers.
Especially to maintain that standard all of the time. I think if you were to teach an outstanding lessons, even just for a month consistently, you would be burnt out and exhausted, and you'd be signed off sick, because the bar is so high that it's just, in practice, unsustainable. What would be quite interesting to hear you tell me is, how do you tell your student and any teacher, how do you tell them to manage that?
You've somewhat already answered my question, my answer on that one. But if they maintain outstanding all the time, then they will be exhausted, and they just won't be able to cope. That's the same for any teacher. I think there's the PGCE year is really quite interesting because there's this preconception about being a teacher, and then there's reality. And I think the reality of how much work you have to do just to get by during 1 week is quite astounding for these student teachers. I think most of them, even though we tell them it's hard work, they don't realise how hard a work it is until they're there. And I think what we say with the outstanding is, as long as you can produce an outstanding lesson, like when you're being formally observed, then if your other lessons are good, then that's okay. But you won't be able to produce an outstanding lesson all the time because you will be exhausted, and you'll probably end up having a mental breakdown, to be honest.
I was just wondering, you were saying about maintaining that standard, and one of the things that you said to differentiate per child. What strategies and ways do you recommend to your student teachers when you're going in to observe them? How do you discuss differentiation, and what is it that you say to them in terms of strategies as to how to approach differentiation for pupils?
Differentiation, when I'm watching a GCSE or an A-level class, I'm very much looking for differentiation by ability, unless there's an SEN pupil within the group, or there's a student with some kind of special need, then I'd expect, maybe a different resource, or a resource which is applicable for that pupil. But if there's not a pupil in the class who has an SEN need, then we are looking by ability. So, if you've got an E grade, how are you pushing them up to the next level? If you've got a B or an A grade, how are you pushing them further? And so it may be, as with business studies, we're always looking at pushing them up to being able to evaluate, or moving away from that content-driven classroom. Because so often with student teachers, they focus on the content, what we call the knowledge, the basic knowing of something. So the definition of an enterprise, or the definition of, a sole trader. And it's moving them up what we call Bloom's taxonomy to be able to evaluate it, to be able to look at the advantages and disadvantages, but actually even push it further, looking at questions like to what extent. So if it's a classroom where it's differentiation by ability, it's looking at the questioning. That's what we're really looking at, is how, not only how you're verbally questioning each one and extending their answers, but if it's within case studies and exercises, how you're also extending their answers and giving the opportunity for them to reach the top of Bloom's taxonomy, get those top grades within an exam.
Do you think differentiation, there's a standard approach to it in terms of what you were saying in questioning? Or do you think, according to subject area, how you would view differentiation is very different according to the subject?
That's an interesting one, because I know some people don't, or they say they don't do it at all. You'll talk to some teachers, they would, I don't differentiate, but actually a lot of the times they do, they just don't realise they're doing it. I think most teachers will differentiate by questioning. So maybe different pupils, they're asked it a slightly different way. They know when they can really push that A grade student, that top end student. If it's differentiation by outcome, which is when you have different questions, let's say on a case study, and they get harder and harder, and of course the best student, or the more able student on that particular subject, can go further and further. I think a lot of all subjects do that. And of course, Bloom's taxonomy, which is this whole knowledge, analysis, evaluation, that's applicable for every subject, because all exams are based on their marking, are based in one way or another on Bloom's taxonomy. That is not different. So I think actually it is applicable to all subjects.
What I'd like to take you to now, Charlotte, if we can, is I know at the university, and I definitely remember doing this when I was at the university, was the university is very good at reflective practice. What really interests me, and I'd like your advice on it, is when you're doing that reflective practice and you're evaluating a lesson, how do you do it correctly? The reason I ask that is it can become quite an obsessive process. So how do you find a balance between being reflective and viewing what you have done in a lesson and what has gone on in a lesson?
Actually, my PhD research is on this, so I could talk about this a long time, but technical reflective practice, which I think is what you're talking about, which is when you reflect after your lesson what went bad, what went well, what you can improve upon. Like, as you know, student teachers have to do that. In fact, even if they say they're not actually writing it down, what they're doing is in their head, they're always thinking it through. And you find with student teachers, to begin with, we actually help them reflect. And as you quite rightly said, on the PGC courses, we get them to actually write down what they did well, what they could improve upon, how they can move forward. But actually, by the end of the PGCE year, what we find is that actually becomes what I call tacit knowledge. It becomes something you do automatically. So even when you've been teaching a while, you think what went well, what could be improved upon in that lesson. You just don't write it down. But I'd say one of the hardest things for student teachers by far is actually removing their emotions from that reflective practice. And actually you find with student teachers, as they go through that PGCE year, they become less emotional about their lessons, which is actually, unfortunately, it's a really important process for them to go through, because otherwise what happens at the beginning of a PGCE course, when you're doing feedback, they've spent hours and hours on this lesson, and you're going to say, right, okay, that's only satisfactory. And they get very upset, and some will cry, unfortunately. And you know why? Because they're so emotionally attached to it. But actually, as they go through the year, they detach almost. So they do that reflective practice, but they don't become emotional. And that's a really important process for them to go through. And some of them will do it very quickly, and some of them, it takes a very long time for them to be able to do it. But actually, if you talk to any student teacher, nearly all of them, by the end of the year, that's a process they've gone through. It's detaching their emotions. And they have to actually think, right, I'm not emotionally attached to this. Just think, it's not personable. What did I do well? What do I need to improve upon? And that actually, it can take a while for them to do that.
The really interesting thing is, you said about taking the emotion out of it, but I think sometimes you have to take the ego out of it, because I think you can get too caught up in that and take it personally.
I completely agree with you. However that emotion manifests itself. And it is hard. It is very hard. But if you're there, it's different when you've been teaching a while. I think you become less emotional. But when let's say if you're straight from university, you've never failed at anything. You've passed your A-levels, your GCSEs, you flew through your degree. You suddenly come on a PGCE course, and actually you'll spend the whole year being analysed, evaluated, and actually, unfortunately, it will be very rare that you will produce a perfect lesson, and it's a very hard process for them. Very hard process.
I think it sets them up for the next 20 years. Okay, thank you, Charlotte. Right, we're going to move on to the inspiration round now. Can you take us to your proudest moment, please?
Ever.
In teaching or education?
My proudest moment in teaching. I suppose for me, it was when I taught A-levels, and it would be when the students received their results and they got into their universities of choice or where they wanted to go next. And that actually was always really, really, really nice, being at the exam hall where they picked up their grades. They came and give you a hug, and they're like, "Oh, thanks, miss," and I've done really well. And off they disappear off to university, and then they come back, or you see them 10 years later or 5 years later, and they're doing really well. And for me, that's the best thing. Was always the best thing about teaching, is where they went on to next.
It always makes the blood, sweat and tears worthwhile.
It does. In teaching, there's not many times you get that kind of feedback. Otherwise, they just go up to the next year and next year and next year. So it's actually really nice when they come back and you see where they've gone and where they've progressed.
Excellent. Thank you. And what we're going to do is move on to the best advice.
Best advice I'd received, and I always pass on to my PGCE students, is box it up and move on. That's the best advice, which is, small things don't matter. Life goes on. And actually, the next day it will seem a lot better, and just get on with it, really. And I have to say, when I give my lecture to the student teachers, I tell them all the same thing.
Teachers get caught up in, being in the classroom every day. It matters because you're affecting people's lives and you're interacting with them, and you're trying to get them qualifications and prepare them for, when they leave school and they go into the outside world. So I can see how people do get fixated on it.
Also, it's to realise when, pupils misbehave in class. I always say it's not to take it personal, because it's not usually about you. It's something else that's going on in their life. And that's also a hard learning process, to realise that they're not the cause. Sometimes there's something else going on. They just end up being on the brunt of it.
Okay, so let's move on to what your sources of inspiration are.
I think, I talked about, for me, it's someone like Pierre Bourdieu, who's a famous sociologist who looked at social, what's called fields of play, and how people react within those fields of play, and the power that goes on between individuals. And I also teach this to the student teachers, that when they enter a school environment, it is really important to watch the politics that are going on, because there's always some politics, not to get involved in the politics if they possibly can, and actually to watch it and stay clear of it, because in schools and in colleges, they tend to be quite rife with what are called micropolitics, interdepartmental politics as well. And actually, it's being aware of it, but trying to keep away from it. And Pierre Bourdieu is very much, he talks about how we present ourselves and how what we say to people and how it's based on this micro power. But actually, it's a very inspirational theory.
I think the first thing someone said to me is make sure you take your own mug in, so you don't take anybody's mug, and make sure you park in the car park space that nobody wants to park in, because then that means it's
don't
okay.
Don't sit in someone else's chair, that's the other one.
Okay, so let's move on to a personal teaching or education habit.
Do you know, I think it's enthusiasm, being prepared and being very enthusiastic and loving your subject. I have to say, I'm very passionate about everything I teach, actually, including business studies. And do you know what? That's very, very important. I think if you start to lose the passion for your subject or what you're teaching, I do think that might be time for you to think about leaving teaching. I think so many teachers perhaps go on a bit, maybe too long, but actually if they feel dead about their subject and what they're teaching, I think it might be time to change their career, because I think it's very important to be enthusiastic about what you are doing and to love it and to carry on learning more about it. Even if you've done it for many, many years and decades, it's really important to carry on learning more.
That's really interesting, because I was talking to Sam Bamford about this in her podcast episode, and she was very passionate about advising teachers to do a secondment back into their subject area, because once you've taught the curriculum 10 years in a row, and you can lose that passion. So I think she was saying that it's really important to actually do a little secondment back into industry and into your subject, so you get back up to speed.
I know in America, for example, when they're teacher training, they actually get teacher trainers to go and spend a semester teaching again if they've been out of teaching for a while. And I have to say, I somewhat agree with that. I think that actually at teacher trainers, you know, we are slightly removed, although we are in classrooms all the time. We don't teach any more, because that's the nature of our job. But I think actually it would be worthwhile us going back to the classroom for like half a term or a few weeks, just to remind ourselves what it's like.
I think it's very easy to forget how hard it is.
I agree with you. And we always say that actually, you know, it's such a tough job, and it has, I think it's got tougher, I have to say, because the hoops you have to jump through are just so much more than they used to be.
We're in agreement on that one. So let's go on to a resource that you can share.
I mean, I think I mentioned Paulo's, I think you say it Prairie, but I think some people say it Prairie, which is the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This book is about critical thinking and what education is about. And I think we need to remember what we think education really is about. Because it's very easy to fill the student teachers' minds with this target setting stuff, this paperwork and the bureaucracy and everything that goes with teaching. But I think once in a while we really have to think back, right, what do we actually want education to be? What do we expect it to be? And this book actually is a very famous book, Paulo Freire, if I think you pronounce it that way. What he's pretty much saying is that actually we need to teach. The pupils actually do have a lot to say. That is very important. Education isn't about just putting in. We actually have to realise that they actually have important things to say, and we have to listen to them as well. And it kind of moves away from just this notion that teachers are there to just keep putting theory and knowledge into pupils' heads. That actually sometimes we need to ask them, you know, what their views are and actually get a lot back from them as well. But it's a very good, an inspirational book, and it's not too long. All
of Charlotte's resources and ideas you can find on our webpage at www.inspirationforteachers.com. We're coming to the end of the show now. What I usually ask guests to do is provide a way of listeners to connect with you. So if anybody had any questions or if they wanted to explore aspects of the podcast with you in a bit more detail.
I have a little webpage, Charlotte Meierdirk in the School of Education. And actually my email is charlotte.meierdirk@port.ac.uk.
Thank you for joining us today on Inspiration for Teachers. For more resources, tips and advice, visit our website, inspirationforteachers.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we would love to connect with you. Just click like on our Facebook page at facebook.com/inspirationforteachers.